Welcome back to A Shark's Perspective. So, you're listening to this show because you like podcasts. And let me just say that I love that you're listening to this one. So, if you look at podcasting today and how brands are using it, you have to look at how TV stations are also using them to tell a lot of great newsworthy stories. Will Johnson is the executive producer of audio and podcast at Tegna's Vault Studios, a voiceover artist, host of the Perfect Scam podcast on AARP, the pregame host of the Puppy Bowl, and he's a subject matter expert on podcasts. And on this episode, we'll discuss creating a podcast, how brands and even TV stations are creating compelling podcasts to tell true crime stories, setting expectations for your podcast, and a lot more. So let's tune in to a TV podcasting expert with a podcast shark on this episode of A Shark's Perspective. Will, thank you so much for joining us today on A Shark's Perspective. If you would, please tell us a little bit about your background and your career to date.
Sure, Shark. Thanks for having me on. I'm always up for talking about podcasting. I'm currently executive producer for podcasts, audio and podcasts with Tegna. Tegna is a company that has a network of TV stations around the country. We have news departments, reporters from Portland, Oregon, all the way to Portland, Maine. A bunch in Texas and everywhere in between. So you can learn more about it. Again, it's Tegna, Tegna. We've launched and we are launching true crime podcasts and have done a few so far since I came aboard earlier this year and have more on the way. I have a long history of working on various podcasts with other companies in my employment history, including Discovery Communications, where I started way back in the mid-2000s and started working on podcasts before many people knew what they are, and or what they were, and then have worked there for a long time on various roles, but always did sort of podcast on the side, sometimes sort of under wraps when the bosses didn't seem to care too much as a sidekick. And we had some fun doing that. We had a show called the Friday News Feedback, which was a science show that we had like this rabid audience for early on before we really knew what we were doing. And I wish we kept doing it because I think it would be doing really well now. It was just three of us, in an office having fun talking about the latest science breakthroughs and news of each week. But we had sort of a contest about it. And people got to know each one of us. I did it with two other guys, and it had a lot of personality, and it was exactly what, in a lot of ways, a podcast can be, and maybe should be for a lot of listeners. So that was cool to do.
Yeah.
But anyway, we had a lot of sort of experience doing it that way. I had a radio background before that in news, also with Sirius and satellite radio, working at Discovery. So a lot of audio in my past. I have, in the past few years, have been on my own. I've done voiceover work and have done some work with AARP, doing podcasts called The Perfect Scam. But like I said, I'm now with Tegna, and we've launched Vault Studios. So sorry, a little long-winded, but Vault Studios is our podcast network.
Well, you didn't even mention your most impressive job in your entire career.
I know.
That's being the pregame host for Animal Planet's Puppy Bowl. For what, 3 years?
I think longer than that, actually. Amazingly, it's gone on for like 4 or 5 years now. Wow. So that's always a fun side hustle as well.
Have you gotten more recognition out of that than anything else?
Depends on who you talk to. A lot of 12-year-olds, a lot of 8-year-olds will enjoy it.
You're very popular at Chuck E. Cheese.
Right. Yeah. No, a lot of you know what, that is a big TV event, and so people see the pregame show, which I've been involved with. But again, that's been sort of a bit on the side and in my past life.
Well, what was interviewing the guys at World's Deadliest Catch like? I mean, that work at the Discovery Channel. I saw the interviews you've done with them as well, and I thought that was an amazing show that I used to watch.
Yeah, it's funny. So Deadliest Catch, right? We actually did a video podcast series. It was really, again, it was the early days of podcasts, if I can say that. It makes me sound like such an old timer, but I guess it was. And
the ham radio days of podcasts.
Right. And we were working on various ideas and companion series to TV shows. And so we went up to Dutch Harbor, Alaska, and did a fair amount of talking to people in the town and doing, companion type pieces to the show, talking to cameramen, talking to captains, like on the docks. And we interviewed them in bars and met townspeople. If you've ever watched a show, you'll get an idea of what I'm talking about. So in a lot of ways, it was like the early days of not just podcasts, but also in a way like figuring out all these ways to extend the viewing experience, extend the brand, extend, whatever you love to watch between seasons. And we rolled those out as a series of podcasts as well. And got a Webby along the way.
Yeah.
There were a lot less people, I think, submitting their work back then for podcasts. Really? And there were. I mean, obviously, there are a lot more now than there were then.
Well, how do you see the state of podcasting today and really where we are with it? I mean, there's so many people that are doing podcasts. I myself started out in radio as well. Oddly, at a time when it was called AM radio, doing sports talk and things like that. And then I worked on FM stations as well. But podcasting is really just, completely exploded when you think of the capabilities of us being able to do this kind of interview at 2:15 in the afternoon my time, as opposed to showing up at some appointment scheduled show at 8 a.m. on a Tuesday. It's exploded. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you see the state of podcasting today.
Well, I think I will probably sound like a lot of people, and no surprise when I say that. I mean, man, it's amazing to see what's happened in the last, like I say, I started doing around 2005, 6, 7, right around in there. So over, almost 15 years, the trajectory, the course, the content explosion in the last, 3, 4, 5 years, the variety of programs, the rabid interest from audiences and fans. And, AM, FM, I started there as well. I'll always have a love for radio. It's a challenging business these days and has been for a while. And, you certainly have other places to go to listen to audio. The idea of listening to something and not looking at something is never going away. As long as we're in cars, for as long as we are every day, a lot of people, or we're at the gym, or we're, vacuuming our floors and want to listen to something, that experience of listening to something and being immersed into a world that, is not presented to you on a platter like video is, of where you're, viewing something, not to take anything away from great video and great movies and great TV shows. But audio as that special hook of visualizing something, especially the content that, I'm working on now with a lot of, crime content, where you're setting a mood and a stage, and, you're describing people and settings and places, all of that, you're evoking, a feeling and a time or a place. It's such a exciting place to be working. And the closest thing I can think of it, when I equate it to another media, I don't think of like TV and film. I think of books.
Yeah.
At least with what we're doing, because you're with books, sure, you're reading those words, and those words are, but with the podcast, you're turning those words into audio and letting someone then, as much as they can, picture a place or picture a person or picture a mood. And I'm not even getting into the actual content of what we're talking about. We can talk more about that, but sure, the state of podcasting is pretty robust right now. It's no surprise.
So I met you at an advertising conference for TV where you spoke on a panel about podcasting and TV. And the session was great and amazing. The panel guests, all of them, you included, were great. As a podcaster, I obviously jumped at the opportunity to hear the session. And you see, Tracy and her podcast have been great for TV of Tomorrow. But you see podcasting being mentioned a lot now on shows, on TV shows. But explain, if you will, how podcasting is being used in coordination with TV, especially with local TV and those companion pieces that you referenced.
Well, so the ones I referenced were definitely a few years back. As far as like how it relates to the TV stations now and sort of the business that I'm overseeing within this company that owns a whole bunch of TV stations. And like I said, that means those news departments, those news stations, all, we have a network of stations across the country that are full of very dedicated, very talented news teams. So let me connect the dots here, and why this makes a lot of sense for what we're working on. True crime is clearly a genre that people are very interested in. There are I used the word earlier, but rabid true crime fans are also people that are just looking for interesting stories, sometimes real life drama, um, and real life stories. And so as we looked at what we have across our TV stations, across our network, is decades and decades worth of archive news content, stories that may relate to, um, if it's a serial killer, sure, it's
Yeah.
about a serial killer, and we can tell those stories using that original archive material. We can also talk to reporters and correspondents and anchor people and photographers, you name it, that have been maybe at a station for decades and decades and have as close a tie to the communities and the stories, as anyone, at least those who are, outside the immediate families and the people who are most affected by these stories. And I want to come back to that because I'm keenly aware and want to talk about, how we sort of approach putting stories out there and being aware of the fact that these are real stories and real people. But so just to close the loop on the dots I'm trying to connect, we have all these stories, we have the people involved, we have, news audio, we have, sometimes it's a drawer that a reporter has in his desk and he's got an interview with somebody that has never seen the light of day. We're talking to all of our stations and saying, hey, what do you have?
Yeah.
What are the stories you've never told? And when I first came aboard, I said to, various stations, look, if you ever covered a case and you wanted to quit your job and write a book about it, this is a great opportunity to tell that story through the medium of a podcast.
Mm-hmm.
So, we don't view these as companion pieces to, we don't, the environment in which I work, we're not putting out, say, a TV program or show. We have obviously newscasts every morning, afternoon and evening and night. So really it's less about a companion and more about a new piece of content, new program, that we're partnering with stations to create and put out there.
Yeah, I often think with true crime, which I'm amazed by how great these true crime dramas sound, and I've just always enjoyed the old days of radio. When you hear like the old shows, sort of those old, where they'd weave the music in, that was more of, a theater of the mind, if you will, with radio and how they would tell crime stories, and you'd hear all that. But it's sort of like Dateline on NBC, the TV show Dateline, but it just really frees up the imagination. I've also always thought with a lot of those stories that, like you talked about, there were reporters wanted to write a book. If you're wanting to resurrect an old cold case, it's almost better to do a true crime story around a podcast, and it gives you a chance to really think about and imagine what could or could not have happened. And I'm fascinated by them now, and really find myself drawn into listening more than just watching on a TV show, even like Dateline. And so it just frees up your mind to do so much.
There's no constraints.
Exactly.
You don't, when people who are not familiar with podcasts, or they're just getting into it, or they're trying to produce one, or, I have conversations frequently where it's sort of like, well, how long does it need to be, or this or that, and everybody wonders about the ideal length, even people that have been in it for a while. But some people think it has to, and not being dismissive of somebody who's just into it, but, obviously they don't have to be a certain length, and we can explore a topic or a case or a story over, if it's 10 episodes and each one is 30 minutes to an hour long, if that's the case, then, you're looking at 5 or 10 hours worth of programming. And I mean, you could really get into something if you cover something that long, as we know from the numerous podcasts that are out there, by the multitude that delve deep. So yeah, this idea, it's funny to me. You mentioned old time radio, and this idea of, we have a word for it now. Everybody's calling it true crime. We'll go with that. But, these are true stories, and they range from all, there's all sorts of ways you can look at, what is crime and what do we want to cover. And we have our ideas about that and what we're working on. And, cases come in all shapes and sizes. But the idea of, covering and talking about and people being interested in that type of story, I mean, that's nothing new. And you go to your bookstore and you see what's popular, whether it's true crime or whether it's even fiction novels. They're stories, they're human dramas about people, about shocking situations sometimes, about mistakes. People have made bad choices. And it's the same thing you're going to see at night on TV, other than, say, I'm not talking about reality shows or dating shows, but, a good crime drama on TV, whether it's true or not, it has all those elements.
Absolutely. So, what's the feedback you're getting from the different stations as well?
Let me clarify a little bit. So the way we're working is that we're going out and talking to stations, and then we are partnering in the sense that we're doing so far a lot of the production on our
Right.
end, and then interviewing reporters, or they're helping us find certain audio from 20 years ago that may be hard to find and may be easy to find. Um, so as far as several things are happening right now. As far as Vault Studios goes, which is what is the business I'm running with various podcasts. We produced one called Bomber about the bombings in Austin from last year. And it's a 6-episode podcast that chronicles the police hunt, the manhunt for the guy who was running around setting off all these bombs in Austin. To the weekly show we're doing now called True Crime Chronicles, where we are covering a different case each week, but using a lot of very extensive archives and talking to reporters again who were on the scene and on the case. Those are shows that we've put out there and that we will continue to guide. And as far as the station response, they love it because we're giving them exposure. Sometimes, it may be a smaller station in a smaller market. It may be a big station in a big market. And they're, across the board, they're all excited to talk about the opportunity of doing something with their reporters, their staff in a different way that's audio that maybe connects with the different audience. We typically will do some sort of digital story. We'll write an article that'll accompany the podcast. They will feature that article. So stations are excited to work with us because I think we're all sort of giving each other a little lift. But the other thing you're seeing are stations, that are coming to us, and it may not be true crime. There's certainly stations out there within our network, within the company, who are doing sports podcasts, or
Exactly.
just talked to 2 young women who are at KSDK in St. Louis. They have a podcast called Abby Eats St. Louis. It's fun. They've got a lot of personality. They're getting it off the ground, and they come to us and have questions about, how do we do this? How do we make it better? Do we want to go beyond St. Louis? All those kind of things. So KSDK, if they're looking at, an opportunity with 2 employees who are driven and ready and will work hard to make something happen on the side, I think that's how you see a lot of podcasts start to lift all boats.
Well, there's so many amazing stories to tell, and I mean, you live in the DC area, which is great and it's wonderful. But I was talking about this just the other day about how rarely do we hear stories in other cities outside New York and Chicago and LA and San Francisco and DC and places like that. There are stories, I brought up Houston, Texas as an example, 4th largest city in the country. A lot of amazing stories to tell, just like there are anywhere. And if you're a station like another Tegna station in Little Rock, they may not get large coverage on a really important story, but your capabilities allow them, if they're not in the Little Rock area watching that show, to be able to listen to the show and find out more about an interesting, put a spotlight on a story that gives you a national and international footprint even. I think that's amazing what podcasting can do. It just helps you dive into those kind of stories a lot further.
Yeah, we hear about cases and stories, or police investigations, or cold cases where they're still looking, obviously, for a suspect, or they're looking for help. And as you can imagine, a lot of times they're big stories, big, well-known cases. It may not be Houston. It may be, right, like a very small
Exactly.
town, and everybody knows about it there. And maybe even on a statewide level, people know about it. But you start to go a few states away, or you start to get across the country, and I mean, I spent a lot of time saying, "Hey, do you know about this story? Do you know about this story?" Because we'll hear about them from a station. A lot of times people just don't know, and so yeah, this does give the opportunity to tell those stories, to talk to families of victims who may have been impacted or who are looking for answers. We have a new podcast launching later this summer, at the end of the summer in August. It's called Bardstown. It's no secret. We put the word out about it. Bardstown, Kentucky has a string of unsolved cases over a period of 3 or 4 years with 5 unsolved murders. The story has been covered a bit on a national scale, but still, most people I mention this who don't know about
Right.
it. This story has been told on a national scale to some extent, but we are working with WHAS, one of our stations in Louisville, and a reporter there who covers crime cases like these cases in Bardstown. Louisville's not far from Bardstown. Her name is Shay McAllister, and we will be rolling out a really deep, about as deep a dive into these 5 unsolved cases as anyone has done, or I would say more than anyone else has done. Shay has connections to the victims' family members. They're excited to tell this story, and we're going to tell it. We're going to let people know that this is not normal by any means for a town the size of this little town in Kentucky. So this is really, an extension of, again, a local story that everybody in this town knows about. Obviously, it's a small town in Kentucky. People have their own theories. There's rumors. There's gossip. There's all sorts of stuff, undercurrents of this and that. And we're going to do our best job to tell what we can tell and what we know of. But it's a story that if you ask someone on the West Coast about it, it's unlikely they've heard of it. So, yeah. That's a long answer to your point, or at least a long response to your point that we have an audience. It's really cool to be able to take something regional or very local and make it a national story.
So where do you see the business of podcasting going as far as where they sit with TV stations, especially in the work that you're concentrating in? I'll talk about the business of podcasting later, but really, how do you want to see a lot of these types of pieces evolve outside of, again, to use the phrase true crime, but I mean, you see so many newscasters doing their own podcasts now. You see a lot of wonderful stories being told as part of this, but what's next?
Well, if I knew what's next, I'd jump right into it. I think it's certainly paying attention to, trends and press and articles, but, you do hear like this is the next big thing, or people are tired of this or tired of that. I don't see what we're doing going anywhere, and I think it can only, as terms of the stations that we're working with, I think we'll see just the quality of the content continue to go up, the storytelling, the narrative approach, the style of storytelling being more sophisticated, more creative, more taking more chances. I think all of that will happen, and I do believe that we're still in the early days of podcast, and so.
Agreed.
In the same way that the business is going to evolve, we're all just playing in a space that, there's unlimited opportunities to tell stories. It's just great. It's a great space to be in. And so when I think about what stations can do, you never know when the next big thing is going to happen. But it's not just about the next big thing. It's about the little things that, you've got an audience for a type of content or genre that's really interested in it, and somebody does it in a really great way. It's great. It's cool to see all that happening.
So how do you see the business of podcasting evolving for brands? I know your focus is on TV, but obviously you probably get asked this by a lot of people in the space. I do a lot. I do a lot of consulting in the space with helping brands form podcasts. I'm always really interested to hear all the new types of strategies, and there's a fear for a lot of brands that simply want to just rush to play in the space, and it's again more than too much content that's out there sometimes, and then a lot of the lower content should disappear, the lesser quality. But how do you sort of see the business of podcasting working with a lot of brands today?
Well, when you talk about business, I think about how people can make it economically viable to continue doing it and continue doing it in a good way. And clearly, there's advertising models and business and revenue models that will continue to evolve and develop, and that hopefully make sense for the content creators that are doing a good job of it. I would say I wouldn't really have anything to say about somebody who's putting something out there and it may not be at a certain level. If they're happy with 5 people listening to it, or their mom and somebody else listens to it, that's great.
Yeah, I agree.
Have fun with it, learn, grow, figure out how to make it a little better, make sure your audio sounds good, and do all those little things that somebody can get into it, that somebody getting into it, needs to know and learn, and talk to people who are doing it and doing it well. Learn from people who sound really good, learn from shows and storytelling that you like a lot. Try to do things differently. I think that continues to be a challenge for anyone who's out there doing this, not just finding stories. That's a huge part of all of this, which, luckily within the current situation that I'm in, as far as growing, our business, for Tegna and Vault Studios, we have all these stations that are able to pitch us ideas and stories, and we have like this collective brain of this hive mind. Sorry, pardon the expression, but of people who know, have an extensive backlog of or an extensive database in their minds of stories they know about. So when we think about the business, I think, again, you said I'm focused on TV stations. I am, because we work with them, but I'm also focused on just growing podcasts
Exactly.
and growing audio. And certainly you're seeing other things, exciting things happen with podcasts if they're being taken into, if that idea is then taken into TV space or movie. There obviously is going to continue to be crossover and transition, and people that are finding content here and taking it there. But I'm really focused on telling good stories with our podcast right now. And so I don't see anything that would get in the way of someone who is doing a really good job and putting the time into it that's needed, making a business out of it. And by business, I don't mean that you're making, if you're one guy on your own or one woman or man trying to put together a podcast, it's still like, there's a bit of luck and a little skill and a little bit of all that involved. As far as bigger companies go, there's so much opportunity because, again, if you've got the right people, and I think if the people at the top care about what you're doing and they see it as a benefit and they believe that, okay, podcast, audio, having a relationship with people outside of the TV realm, outside of the screen, outside of the, just your phone, but maybe, in your car,
Right.
again, at other times of the day, or having a more intimate relationship where it's, you're sitting there listening by yourself to one person talking. That's just that experience of listening to someone, especially over many, many, many hours. I don't think there's anything like it. And as far as making a brand or developing a connection for a brand, I'm sure there's other ways to do it, and they're being done, but I think a podcast like that it's just a great way to make that connection.
So when you look at other podcasts that you're competing against or ones that you produced over your career and you look back and you think, I could have done this better, what do you think makes a good podcast versus a bad podcast? Or at least what do you think that the lessons that you've learned in podcasting that's helped you improve beyond not necessarily a bad podcast, but to make one better?
Right. That's a great question. I think, I mentioned one I did early on with a couple of other guys that was, science, and it was fun and it was personality. And because we had a radio background, at least I did, and, they had, some on-air experience, and it was loose. We were able to have just a fun time and go with that. There's no right or wrong way to do this. I think if you're doing what you set out to do and you have, a purpose, like this is what I want to get across, this is the goal. I think it's worth asking those questions before you do it, and make sure, more than anything, know what your sort of measure of success is. Again, if you're happy with, some family and friends listening to a show, if you want to do a lot more, make sure you have some idea on how you're going to promote it on social. Make sure you have a really great mic, no matter what you're doing. Actually, having a great mic is the first rule of podcasting, in my mind. Set out a plan to, because I think so many people are jumping. Well, I don't think, because so many people are getting into it. You see a lot of people who will start something up and then it's, they don't keep it up, or it just becomes something that's very much an afterthought. If you're, it's like anything in life, but especially with something that you spend, an hour or two a week on, or maybe it's a whole day
Exactly.
or 2 days, you know, um, do a good job at it if you're going to spend that much time on it.
Agreed.
I was going to mention, because we talked about it earlier with true crime in general, as we talked about that, and that genre being so popular. I think we're going to continue to see, and hopefully we'll have, I know we'll have some success in that area with some of the shows we're planning on launching, and we'll be talking about cases and stories and continuing to that are oftentimes extremely difficult to talk about. That just comes with the territory. We are very aware of that. And I think what I see to some extent, and there's a different tone and vibe you can set with your show, with the as a news organization, I think we're pretty. Obviously, we care a lot about the facts and not offering just our opinion of a case or a story, but really presenting something and digging into stories as best we can with veteran reporters and correspondents and anchors who, again, have spent years covering a case. So we're not just telling sort of the top line story in a quick manner. We want to, even in a short amount of time, 25, 30 minutes on our weekly show, give people a good sense of here's what we know, here's what happened. And of course, we want people to listen to our show. And I think the point I'm getting to at the end of all this is that true crime as a genre is not going anywhere. People will continue to listen to it. People have a fascination with stories that are real and have real impact on people's lives. But that's the other side of the coin, is that they do have impacts on real people's lives. And it shouldn't be taken lightly, and it should be covered and discussed and talked about in a way that takes all that into consideration.
I think that podcast for TV stations, for local stations trying to tell a crime story, it gives them such a leg up, if you will, if they know, since they know how to typically do this kind of media, just tell a little more theater of the mind type discovery, but it really gives them a leg up over newspapers, because you equated it to books, and I agree with that. I almost equate a lot of these stories to that really deep, long discussion you would read through in a newspaper. And I love the capabilities of taking a long form article and putting it to a story with music and various interviews. And
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And yeah, no, I thanks. And I appreciate definitely what you're saying there. I think, it's just a huge, it's an interesting discovery process. We hope people discover our podcast, but I think, everyone sort of has their sense of like, this is what I like and don't like. And it may be a voice, it may be the way a story is told, but, it's kind of a fine line, finding that way of telling a story that, has drama, has build up, has, the right mix of voices and music and sound. And there's so many elements that go into it to make it worth someone's time, because if you're putting something out there and it's 10 episodes, like I said earlier, and it's 30 minutes an episode or whatever it is, you're asking somebody to spend a lot of time with you. And so you really have to do it well.
So, Will, you're living in the D.C., Maryland area. You're not that far away from the water. I'd like to know, what is your favorite kind of shark and why? A question you probably haven't been asked on any other podcast.
No, I think I like the tiger shark, because just because it's friendly enough that I don't have to worry about it. You can swim around underwater,
Yeah,
right?
friendly shark.
Not worry
Yeah.
about it. I'm sure things happen. In fact, I think I won't even go there, but let's go with tiger shark.
Okay, I'll go with that. Well, Will, it's that special time in the show. Are you ready for the 5 most interesting and important questions that you're going to be asked today?
Bring it
All
on.
right, here we go. Number 1, the Super Bowl or the Puppy Bowl?
Oh, Puppy
There
Bowl.
you go. Number 2, Audio Technica or a blue microphone?
Blue microphone.
It's okay. Number 3, podcast producer or podcast host?
And I have to choose what I prefer.
Which you prefer?
Oh, that's impossible. That's a rough one. Let's go with producer.
Yeah, I would agree. Number 4, the Washington Redskins or the Baltimore Ravens?
Redskins.
Good choice. Number 5, and the most important question that you're going to be asked today, and a Cowboys fan actually just said, good choice. Number 5, and the most important question that you're going to be asked today is biscuits or cornbread?
Biscuits.
Good man.
I grew up in Tennessee, so I know there's cornbread as a part of the scene there too, but so are biscuits. I'm going to go biscuits.
The state food, I think, is biscuits. So, Will, where can people find out more about you, follow your podcast work, and more?
You can find both Vault Studios, VAULT, on Facebook and Instagram, and also True Crime Chronicles. It's three words on Facebook and Instagram. That's a great way to connect with us and our hosts and our stories. So check it out.
Thank you very much, Will, for being with us today on A Shark's Perspective.
Thanks, Shark. Appreciate your time and all the great conversation.
So there was my conversation with Will Johnson, the executive producer of audio and podcast at Tegna's Vault Studios, a voiceover artist, host of the Perfect Scam podcast on AARP, the pregame host of the Puppy Bowl, and he's a subject matter expert on podcasts. Let's take a look at 3 key takeaways from my conversation with him. First, Will is an expert on podcasts. He made a terrific point on a question that both he and I get often, and that's how long should a podcast be? Quite simply, it's how long it takes you to tell a good story. Constantly focus on that part of the equation and not all the advice you get from so many others on it has to be short form because of how busy we are. Or it has to be long form because people want to immerse themselves deeply in it. Test it out. See what resonates with your audience. Understand that if you're a brand, the ears listening don't want more brand babble on a new channel. Humble yourself and know that not every word you say is gold. Quite simply, focus on telling a good story, whatever that story is, how it will help and or entertain your listeners. Second, we're very early on in podcasting and how we use them. Just look at digital marketing and how old or young that is for comparison. Some are for companion pieces, some live on their own. And it's not always about finding the stories. With podcasts especially, it's also about how you tell them. Are you using them with music, sound effects? Is it just one-on-one conversation? As Will said, and I quote, have fun with it, learn, grow, figure out how to make it a little better. Make sure your audio sounds good. Do all those things that somebody getting into this needs to know and learn. Talk to people who are doing it and doing it well. Learn from people who sound really good. Learn from shows and storytelling that you like a lot. Try to do things differently. That continues to be a challenge for anyone who's out there doing this. It's such a great quote. Third, for quite a few years, I've done radio and podcast work, and one of the things that I hear often now from both people and brands are questions on, should we do a podcast and how do we do one? As Will perfectly said, there are no right or wrong ways to do a podcast. Know what your expectation is before. And that is so true because so many people are jumping into this and then falling out of it. I've got friends and clients who do a couple of shows and then stop. That's really bad when you're a brand trying to leverage a podcast to help people look at you as a thought leader. And like anything else, you've got to look at the long-term strategy and the purpose and what results you expect. You've got to understand beforehand that it takes a lot of time to create and edit and promote a good show like this. Will is so right when he says, do a good job on it if you're going to spend that much time on it. All I would like to add here is that you should create a plan that works and then work to your plan. Don't just jump in with podcasting and then fall out quickly, like a majority of people who look at this as some sort of short-term or quarterly project. Look at the long game, and most importantly, as Will reminds us, is have a good mic. Such a good point. So got a question, send me an email to Kenneth at asharksperspective.com. Thank you for the privilege of your time. So podcast up, be a shark, and join us on the next episode of A Shark's Perspective.